There are moments in history that arrive with force, loud, dramatic, impossible to ignore. And then there are moments that slip into the world quietly, like the last breath of a giant no one noticed was dying. These quiet moments do not appear on breaking news alerts. They do not trigger emergency briefings. They do not send social media into a frenzy. They move softly, almost invisibly, while the world carries on as if everything is the same. Yet underneath the calm surface, everything has shifted. This is one of those moments. There was no dramatic headline, no televised announcement, no world leader stepping up to a podium. Only silence. A silent signature on a document that almost no one saw. A silent change to an agreement the world assumed would last forever. A silent ending to one of the most powerful financial arrangements in modern history. The petrodollar, America's great financial invention, the hidden force behind its military strength, its economic comfort, its influence over global trade, and the lifestyle it enjoyed for decades, has quietly taken its final breath. Most people didn't notice. Most won't understand what disappeared until the consequences reach their own lives. But one day, historians will point to this moment and say that was the turning point. It was the moment the foundation of the modern world shifted beneath our feet. For 50 years, the United States enjoyed a privilege no empire in history ever possessed. It could print the world's most important currency, and in return, the world supplied it with oil, the resource that powered everything. This system was simple, profitable, and deeply embedded in global trade. It felt as if it would last forever. But no system built on power remains untouched forever. That era is ending, and this is the story of how it began, why it worked, who created it, who protected it, who challenged it, and why its quiet collapse will reshape not just countries, but the entire world order that future generations will inherit. This is the story of the petrodollar's death. Before the petrodollar existed, the United States was strong and growing, but it was not the unmatched superpower it would later become. After World War II, the world stood exhausted and broken. Europe's cities were reduced to piles of rubble. Japan was rebuilding from devastating losses. Economies were unstable, currencies were weak, and inflation spread from country to country like a shadow no one could escape. In those uncertain years, only one thing remained trusted across borders: gold. The United States held more gold than any other nation. At Fort Knox and the vaults of the Federal Reserve, mountains of gold represented the world's faith in something solid and real. Because America held the gold, the world trusted the US dollar. And in 1944, a peaceful resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, world leaders gathered to design a new financial system. The agreement they created tied the US dollar to gold, and every major currency in the world was tied to the dollar. It was clear it was stable. For a while, it worked beautifully. The world began to heal. Trade revived. Countries rebuilt their industries and their cities. The global economy finally felt stable again after years of trauma and chaos. But beneath this calm surface, small cracks began to form. Cracks no one wanted to see. As Europe and Japan rebuilt their strength, their factories reopened, their industries modernized, and their economies began to grow rapidly. They no longer needed American aid the way they once had. They traded more. They exported more. And soon, they looked at the agreement and began to question it. Why should they keep holding so many US dollars when, according to the rules, they could exchange those dollars for gold? Why hold paper when they could demand the real thing? So they did. At first, the requests came gently. Formal letters, diplomatic visits, polite reminders of the Bretton Woods promise. But soon, those polite requests hardened into urgent demands. One nation after another brought shiploads of US dollars back to American shores and asked the same question: where is our gold? At first, the United States honored those requests. Gold flowed out of its vaults in steady streams. But as the demands grew larger, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. America had created more dollars than it had gold to support. There simply wasn't enough. The trust that held the global system together, the trust that everyone believed was unbreakable, began to fall apart. Foreign governments saw it happening. American economists whispered about it behind closed doors. Financial markets felt the tremors before the public even knew something was wrong. The outflow of gold sped up. Confidence in the dollar weakened. Pressure on Washington increased until it became unbearable. Finally, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television. His voice was calm, steady, almost reassuring, but the decision he announced shook the entire world. With a single declaration, he closed the gold window, ending the ability of foreign countries to exchange their dollars for gold. With the stroke of a pen, the dollar was no longer tied to anything solid. It floated freely, supported only by belief and political power. The world panicked. Without gold, countries no longer trusted the dollar to hold its value. Inflation surged across continents. Exchange rates swung wildly. Some national currencies crashed into disaster. Banks struggled, governments scrambled. The international financial system suddenly felt like a ship without an anchor, drifting through a storm with no compass and no land in sight. America's reputation took a hit. A nation once seen as the world's financial backbone now seemed unpredictable. The carefully constructed architecture of Bretton Woods was breaking apart. The United States needed a solution, and it needed one quickly. It needed a new foundation for its currency, something universal, something every country relied on, something essential to survival, beyond politics, beyond borders, beyond ideology. And then the realization came, simple but world-changing. Oil was the new gold. In 1974, under the blazing desert heat of Saudi Arabia, far from journalists, far from public debate, far from anything resembling transparency, a meeting took place that would quietly rewrite the future. There were no press conferences, no treaty ceremonies, no photographs of leaders smiling and shaking hands. Instead, there was a heavily guarded room, a long polished table, and a handful of men who understood that true power operates in silence. On one side sat the United States, representatives from the Treasury, the State Department, and the CIA. These were not ordinary officials. They were strategists, planners, guardians of the American empire. They knew that without a new system, the dollar could collapse. And if the dollar fell, America's global influence would fall with it. On the other side sat the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. At the time, the kingdom was young, wealthy, and increasingly influential. Not because of military might or financial markets, but because beneath its dunes lay the world's richest oil reserves. Every factory, every military, every vehicle, every economy on earth needed what Saudi Arabia controlled. Their power was simple, pure, and absolute. The world ran on their oil. The Americans understood this. The Saudis understood it too. And that mutual understanding became the foundation of one of the most important deals in modern history, one that would quietly redraw the architecture of global power. What happened in that quiet room would not just save the dollar. It would not merely stabilize a collapsing financial system. It would create an entirely new world order, one where currency, energy, and geopolitical influence fused into a single mechanism of control. This was not a treaty, not an alliance sealed with flags and signatures, not a ceremonial pact recorded in textbooks or announced at press conferences. This was something far more powerful, a strategic exchange crafted in whispers, shaped by necessity, and bound by survival. This was a deal, the kind of deal that doesn't just change history, but bends it. The United States made its offer with the precision of a master chess player moving the queen into a position of absolute dominance. Sell your oil exclusively in US dollars. 14 words. Simple, direct, calculated, a request on the surface, an ultimatum beneath it. But America did not place those words on the table alone. They were followed by the real currency of the negotiation. Not cash, but protection, influence, and power. In return, we will protect your kingdom from any threat, foreign or domestic. We will supply you with the most advanced American weapons. We will train your military. We will safeguard your oil fields. We will guarantee your security. We will support your leadership, publicly, privately, and globally. We will be your shield. For Saudi Arabia, a young kingdom sitting on oceans of oil but surrounded by rivals, instability, and geopolitical predators, this was not simply a proposal. It was a lifeline, a guarantee of survival backed by the world's most capable military and the most influential political power on Earth. And for the United States, it was the key to something far greater than security or regional influence. It was the opportunity to build a new empire, an empire not carved out by conquest, but engineered through financial dependency. Saudi Arabia agreed. With a simple handshake, quiet, discreet, unpublicized, the petrodollar was born. A global system that would bind nearly every nation on Earth to the American financial engine. By 1975, the ripple became a wave. Every OPEC nation followed, not out of enthusiasm, but because they had no realistic alternative. The world needed oil. Factories needed it to run. Vehicles needed it to move. Homes needed it to heat. Entire economies depended on it to function. And if oil required US dollars, then every nation needed US dollars too. So the inevitable happened. Central banks accumulated massive dollar reserves. Governments stockpiled treasuries as safe storage for those dollars. Global trade began rotating around the US currency. Every barrel of oil bought with US dollars strengthened America's financial throne. Without firing a single shot, without occupying a single country, without planting a single flag in foreign soil, the United States constructed the most profitable and enduring financial empire in human history. The brilliance was staggering. The world didn't just use the dollar. The world needed the dollar, and as long as nations needed energy, they needed America. The petrodollar became the invisible skeleton of global finance, the silent engine running beneath every transaction, every reserve, every economy. But power, true power, always creates resistance, and every empire, no matter how influential, eventually feels the pressure of rising competitors. For decades, the petrodollar stood unchallenged, an invisible throne upon which America sat confidently. Nations complained in private, economists warned in academic circles, and rival powers muttered about reform. But no challenger was coordinated enough or powerful enough to threaten the system. Until now. The shift did not arrive with warplanes or proclamations. It arrived slowly, quietly, like hairline fractures forming in a dam that once seemed unbreakable. A crack here, a fracture there, a policy shift, a new alliance, a subtle but unmistakable change in global momentum. New powers began to rise, each carrying decades of frustration and strategic ambition toward the dollar's dominance, each quietly building the tools to free themselves from it. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the petrodollar faced a challenge strong enough, organized enough, and determined enough to threaten its throne. Russia, cornered by Western sanctions, had little choice but to act. It began selling oil in rubles, yuan, and other currencies preferred by its buyers, anything but the dollar. What started as a practical necessity soon became a deliberate strategy. Moscow no longer wished to prop up a system that could be wielded against it. Each transaction in alternative currencies became both a political statement and a step toward financial independence. China, ever patient and methodical, played a different game. Its vision extended across continents and decades. With an economy built on manufacturing and global trade, China sought not just to participate, but to lead. It introduced the petro-yuan, oil contracts denominated in Chinese currency, and backed by the promise of gold convertibility. This was not merely an alternative to the dollar. It was an open invitation to nations weary of dependence on U.S. financial dominance. Nations could now see a path to autonomy, and China positioned itself at the center. India, the world's fastest-growing major economy, began paying for oil in rupees. This decision reflected more than economics. It was a statement of independence. New Delhi reorganized its energy and foreign policy around self-reliance, signaling that the era of letting American currency dictate national strategy was over. Meanwhile, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Argentina, and a dozen other nations quietly explored alternatives. They experimented with local currency swaps, yuan settlements, gold-backed trade agreements, and bilateral deals that bypassed the dollar entirely. Initially uncoordinated, these actions shared a common thread. The world was moving toward a new financial reality, and the dollar was no longer untouchable.